Outside the front doors of a sunlit church in small-town America, a man crouched on cold concrete, his clothes torn, his hands trembling. He murmured for mercy, for kindness, only to be dismissed with scorn. "Get a job, you lazy bum," spat a passerby, her voice sharp as a slap, before clipping past without a pause. But that man, broken and ignored, was no stranger to wealth. He was William "Will" Harrison, sole heir to the Harrison Empire. That day he did not break to find God, he tested humanity. What he would uncover about love, false piety, and the coldness behind polished smiles would shake an entire congregation. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Why would a billionaire's son disguise himself as a beggar? Why would William Harrison, the sole heir to one of America's most powerful fortunes, trade his mansion for rags, his luxury cars for bare feet, and his name for silence? What truth was he seeking in the shadows of a church? What did he uncover about the women who filled the pews each Sunday, lifting their hands in praise but walking past him as if he were invisible? And most of all, who was the one woman who looked beyond his filth, beyond the smell of hunger, and into the very heart of his soul? This was not simply a test of kindness, it was a revelation of greed, hypocrisy, and unexpected grace. And the answer to these questions would forever change William's destiny. Andrew Miller was not an ordinary man. Born into unimaginable wealth as the only son of billionaire Charles Miller, Andrew grew up surrounded by luxury that most men could only dream of. Yet those who truly knew him spoke less about his fortune and more about his character. Handsome, educated, and deeply rooted in the faith his parents had passed down, Andrew lived with a sense of morality rarely seen among the rich. His father, Charles, was known across boardrooms and charity galas as a shrewd businessman, but behind closed doors he was a man who feared God. Charles believed his empire was not just built for profit, but for purpose. And he often reminded Andrew that true wealth lay not in money, but in the family and legacy one leaves behind. And so, as Andrew reached the prime of his life, Charles began urging him toward the next great decision: marriage. Among the women in their congregation, few names carried as much weight as Susan Carter. Elegant, striking, and commanding every room she walked into, Susan was the choir leader adored by many. Her voice filled the sanctuary like a symphony, her beauty capturing admiration from men and envy from women. But beneath her polished smiles and carefully rehearsed charm, there was an arrogance she did little to hide. She lived for attention, and she wore her position like a crown, reminding others sometimes subtly, sometimes bluntly, that she was not like them. While most eyes were fixed on her during Sunday services, few noticed another woman who quietly served with devotion in the shadows. Her name was Grace Johnson. Grace Johnson was a single mother, raising her little boy while working long hours as a cleaner during the week and serving humbly as an usher in church on Sundays. She owned no fine clothes, no jewelry that sparkled beneath the stained glass windows, no voice that could command a choir. What she had instead was a heart that poured itself into kindness, a soul that understood struggle, and a faith that was unshaken by hardship. Grace often went unnoticed, overlooked by those who valued appearances more than substance. Yet it would be Grace, not Susan, whose compassion would one day stand as a light in Andrew's darkest test. Because in time, Andrew Miller would discover a chilling truth, that in the very house of God, appearances can become the greatest disguise of all. Andrew Miller had listened to his father's words with respect, but deep inside he carried an unease that few could understand. Charles Miller urged him to marry, but Andrew could not simply choose a wife based on beauty, status, or the applause of men. He longed for a woman whose heart beat with sincerity, a woman who would love him not for the Harrison fortune, but for the man he truly was. And so, after days of restless thought and nights of quiet prayer, Andrew made a decision that would shock even his closest advisors. He would walk away from his world of comfort and conceal his identity, stepping into the skin of the very people most rejected by society. One Sunday morning, As the congregation gathered in polished suits and dazzling dresses, Andrew wrapped himself in tattered clothes, smeared dirt upon his face, and positioned himself just outside the church doors as a beggar. The first week of his test unfolded like a silent play, each step of the drama echoing louder than he could have imagined. Susan Carter, radiant in her flowing dress and sparkling jewelry, approached the entrance with her usual entourage of admirers. Andrew whispered for mercy. His voice cracked, his hands stretched weakly for help. But Susan did not soften, she hardened. "Get a job, you lazy fool," she spat, brushing past him without even a flicker of compassion. Her heels clicked against the pavement like a cold reminder that image, not mercy, was what ruled her heart. A pang of disappointment struck Andrew, but before he could dwell on it, another figure approached. Grace Johnson, with her young son's hand tucked in hers, paused at the sight of him. She reached into her modest purse, pulling out a few wrinkled bills and half of the sandwich she had packed for her child. She smiled gently as she placed them in his trembling hand, whispering a quiet blessing before stepping inside. Andrew sat in stunned silence long after the service had begun. The contrast between Susan's sharp dismissal and Grace's gentle kindness replayed in his mind again and again. Was this a sign from heaven, or merely the randomness of human choice? Could one moment reveal the truth about a person's soul, or was he rushing toward conclusions too quickly? The questions haunted him as he sat outside the sanctuary, unseen and unheard, while voices inside lifted songs of worship that seemed to ignore the pain on the very doorstep. And as he walked away that day, his heart weighed heavy with both disappointment and curiosity. Andrew resolved that his test was far from over. What he had witnessed might have been chance. But the next Sunday, when he tried again, things would turn darker. Andrew Miller's disguise was not a one-time experiment. What began as a single Sunday outside the grand doors of St. Mark's soon grew into a weekly ritual. Each Sabbath he wrapped himself again in torn clothes, smudged dirt across his face, and positioned himself on the same cold slab of concrete where others entered to lift their voices in worship. And each Sunday, the truth revealed itself with sharper edges. Susan Carter, the glamorous choir leader admired by all, passed him by with an ever-hardening heart. At first she spat words like knives. "Get a job. You're nothing but a burden." The following week she went further, laughing with her friends as she mocked his ragged clothes. Her laughter was loud enough to turn heads, but not one person dared to challenge her. She was adored in the sanctuary, and none suspected the cruelty she reserved for the weak outside its doors. Grace Johnson, however, told another story. Though her purse was thin and her own son often went without, she never approached Andrew empty-handed. One Sunday it was a small piece of bread wrapped in paper. The next week, a handful of coins pressed gently into his palm. On another, it was simply a kind smile and a whispered prayer. Grace had no riches to give, but what she gave cost her more than anyone knew because it came from sacrifice. Her goodness was not performative, not staged for the eyes of others, but born of a compassion that could not be hidden. And while the crowd flowed in and out of the church blind to his existence, Grace saw Andrew as human. To Andrew, her actions spoke volumes, yet he wondered if kindness alone was enough to reveal the truth about a person's soul. Andrew did not rely only on memory. Each evening, back in the safety of his estate, he opened a leather-bound journal and carefully recorded the reactions he witnessed. He wrote of Susan's scorn, of her dismissive glances and stinging words. He noted Grace's sacrifices, the tenderness in her eyes, the weariness in her smile, the way she carried herself with dignity despite hardship. Every page grew heavier, not with ink, but with the weight of revelation. And yet, what struck Andrew most was not only the stark difference between these two women, it was the silence of the many who walked past, choosing neither cruelty nor kindness, as if indifference cost them nothing. Inside the church, irony unfolded with painful clarity. From the pulpit, the pastor raised Susan Carter as a shining example. He praised her dedication to the choir, her beauty, her voice that brought heaven down to earth. The congregation applauded, nodding in admiration, their eyes filled with reverence. And Andrew sat there in disguise, still aching from the sting of Susan's insults just outside the door. The hypocrisy cut deeper than he expected. The people's vision was blinded by performance, their applause ringing for a woman whose true heart they had never seen. Andrew began to realize his test was no longer about marriage alone, it was about exposing the truth buried beneath appearances. As Andrew Miller continued his quiet investigation, his disguise gave him access to whispers never meant for his ears. It was on a warm Sunday afternoon, hidden just beyond the choir room's open window, that he overheard Susan Carter speaking with her closest friends. Her laughter rang out, not with humility, but with arrogance. She spoke of Andrew Miller, the billionaire's son, not as a man, but as a prize. "Do you know what it means to marry into that kind of fortune?" she bragged, her voice dripping with superiority. "I will never work a day in my life, and I'll make sure everyone knows I am above them." Her friends giggled in agreement, feeding her pride, as she belittled others in the congregation. For Susan, church was a stage, her voice and beauty the performance, and Andrew Miller nothing more than her golden ticket. And in that moment, the mask slipped, revealing a motive rooted not in love, not in faith, but in greed. Yet in stark contrast stood Grace Johnson, whose story unfolded quietly, almost invisibly to the world. Grace was not merely a struggling single mother, her hardships ran deeper. Years earlier, she had been abandoned by the father of her child, left to carry the burden alone. With little support, she worked 2 jobs, sometimes going without meals so her son could eat. But what few realized was that Grace also cared for her ailing father, a man confined to his bed by illness, relying on her not only for food and shelter but for dignity in his final years. And still, despite exhaustion, despite poverty, Grace arrived at church each Sunday, not for recognition, not for applause, but to serve. She ushered people to their seats with a tired smile, offered prayers when her own heart was heavy, and gave kindness when she herself desperately needed it. Grace's life was not easy, but her spirit remained unbroken. To Andrew, the contrast could not have been sharper. Susan Carter represented everything his father had warned him about: a woman who sought the crown without the cross, who desired wealth without sacrifice. She was adored in public, yet her heart held no love beyond herself. Grace Johnson, overlooked and dismissed by many, carried burdens most could not endure, and yet gave all she could, expecting nothing in return. Watching this unfold, Andrew's heart began to ache, not because of his own disguise but because of what it revealed. For the first time in his life, wealth felt like a barrier, blinding others to truth, drawing pretenders into his orbit, and hiding those who possessed the greatest treasures of all: faith, humility, compassion. And then came the breaking point. One Sunday morning, as Andrew sat once again in his disguise, he felt the full weight of what he had witnessed. Susan, radiant and smiling, sang before the congregation, her voice earning thunderous applause. Grace, weary yet steadfast, guided an elderly man to his seat, unnoticed by most. Andrew's chest tightened. He could no longer remain silent, no longer live in shadows. The test had run its course, and the answers stood before him as clear as day. His heart pounded as he whispered to himself, it was time to reveal the truth. The sanctuary was filled with music as the final hymn faded into silence. People bowed their heads in prayer, preparing to leave with their hearts uplifted. But on that morning, as sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, a different kind of revelation was about to unfold. From the back of the church, the beggar who had sat for weeks unnoticed began to rise. His hands trembled, not from hunger this time, but from the weight of the moment. Slowly, Andrew Miller, hidden beneath rags and dirt, walked down the aisle. At first, murmurs rippled through the congregation, some whispering in discomfort at the sight of the disheveled man interrupting their service. But as he reached the front and removed the layers of disguise, a collective gasp shook the room. The faces of the congregation turned pale as recognition struck. The man they had scorned, ignored, and insulted was none other than Andrew Miller, son of billionaire Charles Miller. All eyes darted toward Susan Carter. She froze in her place, her hands trembling as her voice, once so proud and commanding, fell silent. The same lips that had cursed the man outside now quivered in humiliation. For weeks she had strutted through those doors, stepping over the heir she long sought to marry, mocking him as worthless. Now her arrogance was laid bare before the very congregation that had applauded her. Grace Johnson, however, stood in stunned disbelief. Her eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat, as Andrew walked toward her. She had given bread, coins, prayers, not knowing she was ministering to a man who had everything the world could offer. And now, before everyone, that man approached her with tears in his eyes. Andrew raised his voice so the whole church could hear. "I was not searching for beauty, nor for wealth, nor for status," he said firmly. "I was searching for love, for a heart that sees beyond appearance, beyond riches, beyond the surface of things." His words cut through the silence, leaving many shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Then, turning toward Grace, Andrew's voice softened. "Week after week, when others passed me by, you gave from your poverty. You gave bread when you had little. You gave coins when you could have saved them for yourself. And you gave kindness when I had done nothing to deserve it. Grace Johnson, your heart has revealed more riches than money could ever buy." As tears welled in Grace's eyes, the congregation erupted in whispers, some in awe, others ashamed of their own blindness. Susan Carter, her face red with fury, could no longer bear the weight of humiliation. With her head lowered and pride shattered, she stormed out of the church, the echo of her heels fading into silence. The same people who once admired her watched in disbelief, realizing that the image they worshipped had been nothing more than an illusion. Andrew, unmoved by her exit, remained fixed on Grace. In front of everyone, he extended his hand and asked the simplest yet most powerful of gestures. "Would you join me for dinner with my family?" It was not merely an invitation to a meal, but a symbolic acceptance and acknowledgement that her worth, her humility, and her strength had elevated her above the wealth and vanity that so many had chased. And in that moment, the church witnessed what true love looked like. Andrew Miller's story does not end with wealth, nor does it end with scandal. It ends with a mirror held before us all. Because what unfolded in that church was not simply a test for Susan Carter or Grace Johnson, it was a test for every soul who claims to walk in faith, who claims to value love above appearances. Andrew's journey forces us to confront a difficult truth. When faced with someone in need, when confronted by the hungry, the homeless, the forgotten, who would you be? Would you be Susan, admired outwardly, praised for your beauty and status, yet blind to compassion? Or would you be Grace, giving even when it costs you, seeing value where the world sees none? These questions reach far beyond the walls of a sanctuary. They strike at the heart of our humanity. So we ask you now, who are you? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story moved you, subscribe now, because the story we tell next will shake you even more.